Termination Shock is Neal Stephenson's 2021 release, and at the time of this recording, it is his most recent novel. I have read 3 other Neal Stephenson books. All right, at its heart, Termination Shock has a wonderful premise, like every Neal Stephenson book that I've read so far has. Termination Shock is a near-future hard sci-fi novel about geo-engineering. Now, it follows a number of characters. It actually has a very large cast, but at its core, there are 3 main characters. Saskia, who is the Queen of the Netherlands. Rufus, who is a kind of hard Scrabble Texan with a military past. And Lox, who is a Canadian Indian who practices martial arts and travels to India. So it takes a lot of gymnastics to make these characters kind of come together and mesh. And this plot is about as underdeveloped as anything I've ever read by Stephenson. Now, not being a hardcore Stephenson fan, I can't say this with any certainty, but what I've heard from other Stephenson fans and the few books of his that I've read, it seems to me that he is a premise writer. He has these marvelous ideas. But more than that, he's also very good with language. He can craft a great sentence and really just spin you up. And he's really good at explaining technical things to a layman. The problem is, for my money, that this book is 700 pages and about 400 pages of its length is Stephenson explaining how things works. And I can deal with that for about 100 pages or so. But if this book was 200, 300, or 400 pages long, it would have been so much better. I got completely bogged down in all the technical details. And it was in every chapter. Almost on every page, somebody is explaining something to somebody else. This is definitely a book of conversations. People sitting in a room talking to each other. People sitting on a helicopter talking to each other over the microphones. People driving in a car talking to each other. It's just conversation after conversation after conversation. They're looking at data displays. They're discussing strategies. They're looking at schematics. They're watching YouTube videos and seeing what's happened somewhere else. And far too often, the action of this book takes place off the page. The big things happen and none of the huge cast of characters are there to experience it firsthand. That's not true entirely. There are a few scenes where some shit goes down, but mostly when the action happens, we hear about it from other people in conversations, or we find out about it on the news, or it's on a YouTube video and they rewatch it and replay it, or it's on security footage. It's just people sitting down talking to each other or analyzing an event that happened somewhere else. It's like the camera was in the wrong place for this book. If the book is being filmed, right? Termination Shock really felt like a behind the scenes look at a better action movie. I mean, if you look at this cover and you read the opening 100 pages, you think you're set up for a traditional thriller. And a traditional thriller about climate change and geoengineering in the hands of Neal Stephenson sounded like a great idea to me. I was thrilled to get started on this one. And the opening of the book was thrilling, and it was everything that I wanted it to be. And then I don't know what happened. I don't know why he walked away from the strategy that he opened the book with. There were characters who had dilemmas. They had to make decisions. They had to actually do things and move from place to place. And then the book just devolved into meetings and conversations and telephone calls. And that just stretched on for just about the rest of the length of the book. Now, that's not to say that these conversations were dull. Far from it. Every single conversation and every single scene had something that was interesting in it. And it's the only way I got through the book at all, really, is that this book wasn't boring. I didn't dislike Termination Shock. I just felt like Stephenson missed an opportunity to knock one out of the park. This could have been so exciting. If you wanted to read a Neal Stephenson book about someone who is upset about the environment and takes action into their own hands, read Zodiac. That was his first novel. And I hate to say this. I don't know how many years have passed since he wrote Zodiac. I'll put it up on the screen. But in the years that have passed since Zodiac and Termination Shock, Stephenson's become a better writer, but he hasn't become a better novelist. And I read a review somewhere on Goodreads, and somebody said that he's become uneditable, that's their worry, that he's become so famous and so prolific that he's become uneditable. I'm afraid that might be true. The last book of Stephenson's that I read was Fall. And again, wonderful premise, engaging plot at the beginning, lots of really interesting things happening in Fall with uploading your consciousness to a computer, the ramifications of doing so, and maybe the technical achievements of that have to be in place before that's even possible. It was a really cool book, and it kind of looked at a near future world similar to Termination Shock, where things are politically unstable in the United States, and it was I was into it, but as the book went on, it sort of fizzled out. Like it fell victim to entropy, right? Like it's spreading out, and it's like dissipating instead of becoming more and more focused as time goes on. Like I'm starting to feel like, what is this book even about? And that's exactly how I felt in Termination Shock. It could have used with a lot of tightening down. Now, this is a globe-trotting book. The bulk of the book does take place in Texas, but there's also a big chunk that takes place in the Netherlands and in India and Papua New Guinea and some other places. But if this book, I think, had focused on just one location and just one set of characters and zeroed the plot in to one of the plot lines, which is the geoengineering that started the whole thing off. And there's a site called Pinatubo that launches powdered sulfur into the atmosphere to try to absorb CO2 and thus cool down the planet. That's the geoengineering aspect. In a nutshell, that's what's going on. If the book had just focused on that, I could have handled all the discussions about how the biggest gun in the world worked and how sulfur absorbs CO2, and I could have like wrote all that out. But when we go to the Netherlands, we have to hear about their geoengineering, which is a series of levees and dams to keep the sea from flooding the low country. And when we go to Papua New Guinea, we have to hear about this mountaintop removal mine and the subsequent second gun that's going to put sulfur into the atmosphere. And we have to hear about things in Saudi Arabia, these different airplanes that are going to do the same thing. And it's like everywhere we go, we have to hear these tedious lectures. Now, these lectures are interesting, and the science is interesting, but it just makes for a super tedious plot. There's no story. Or rather, there is a story, but it comes in fits and starts. There's a story at the beginning, there's like hints of story in the middle, and then the story kind of resumes and then abruptly ends at the very end of the book. All the lectures and conversations about science and technology are interesting. They're very cool. It's fun to read about, fun to learn things. I'm into it. But like I said, it makes for a tedious plot, and it just makes me wish that Termination Shock had been a nonfiction book. That would have been a better book. He has enough research in this fictional novel to have written a nonfiction book about geoengineering. It could have tackled what geoengineering is, how we might implement it, what the causes are. What is Termination Shock anyway? What are the dangers of starting down the road of geoengineering if you can't just stop, if you can't cut it off, because the rebound effect would be catastrophic? That's Termination Shock. But we don't learn what Termination Shock is until halfway through the book, at least. In fact, putting sulfur into the atmosphere doesn't come up for about 200 pages. This book is 700 pages long, so I have to read 200 pages before I even knew what this book was about. Now, like I said, Stephenson is a fine writer of words. His prose is very nice to read. It's funny at times, and he keeps the pace moving, and he's a good writer. There was a time when I prized good writing and sounding smart over everything else. But as time goes on, I start to value things like theme and story and character development. Sadly, all those things are lacking in this book, or just missing entirely. I would say that there is no character development in this book for any character. They go through changes, sort of, or they go through phases in their life, but they don't really change. The people you like at the beginning, you like for the same reasons at the end, but you don't really like them because they're deep people. You like them because they're two-dimensional archetypes of characters that we all like. They're plucky, or they're strong, or they're funny, or they're driven, and we like those qualities in people, so we like the characters. We don't like them for any other reason, though. I didn't see myself in any one of these characters.
Okay, editing note, I wanted to address something that I kind of insinuated, that the themes were lacking in this book. And I don't want to say that this book is without theme. Far from it. Termination Shock addresses climate change and our responsibilities and our roles, and to what extent do we need to take action, and that is heavily explored, and I think those are all important themes. And it also tackles the politicization of these responsibilities, and I think it does so, without really alienating any one side. I think that's a big feat for any author to undertake. So kudos to Stephenson for tackling all those major themes. So when I say that this book is lacking in theme, I guess what I'm really trying to say is that I would have liked to see, in a fictional sense, more relationship between the characters' internal lives with the outward plot of the book. And there just really wasn't any of that. Everything was very surface level, which I find sort of disappointing.
So, Termination Shock, do I recommend this? I would say that if you are interested in geo-engineering and you like hard sci-fi, definitely. I would say that if you want to read a tech thriller, find a different book. Read Zodiac. Read his first book. This is more tech than thriller for sure. Anyway, that's all I got on this one. Do the whole like and subscribe thing, and I'll see you in the next one. Hey, a quick side note is that I tend to read a lot of books simultaneously, and I don't normally have any trouble keeping them separate in my head. But on the same day that I read Termination Shock by Neal Stephenson, I was reading Cormac McCarthy's The Passenger. And on the same day that I read them, a character in each book, a salvage diver, visited Port Sulphur, Texas. And so that was actually kind of difficult, like, as days went by, to keep that straight, like which events happened in which books. And I just thought that was a strange coincidence. I'd never even heard of Port Sulphur, Texas before. So for a salvage diver to visit Port Sulphur, Texas in both of the books that I read on the same day, that was very strange.